We are here today at the home of Dr. David Pawliger and his wife, Harriet. Thank you so much, Dr. Pawliger, for agreeing to be interviewed.
You're welcome.
It's certainly our Samuel Proctor Oral History Program is really honored to be able to talk with you. And so thank you. My name is Paul Ortiz. It is Thursday, September 12th. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind, sir, talking about a little bit about your early life, kind of growing up, about your family background, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, I was born in the Bronx, New York, Bronx Hospital, and lived there until I was 10 going on 11, when for business reasons my family moved to Reading, Pennsylvania, and graduated from high school in Reading. Those were really good years in high school. And from Reading I went to Boston, MIT, started off in civil engineering, decided to change my major to medicine. So I took pre-med electives and finished at MIT and came to the University of Florida Medical School in 1959.
Wow. What was Gainesville like in 1959?
Quite different. It was. My sister and I came, she came as a freshman student, and I came as a freshman medical student. We stayed at the Bambi Motel overnight on 441 South. I think it lasted for a long time, but it's gone now. Downtown was like any southern small town. There were a couple of movie theaters downtown, a couple of drive-in theaters outside of town, and then there was a university. I think the boundaries development went as far as 34th Street on the west side, and then you were out in the country.
Growing up in the North, what were some of the differences or contrasts that you saw when you first came to Florida?
My family moved to Florida after I finished my freshman year, also for business reasons, freshman year of college. And Florida was different than it is now. It didn't have the development that it has now, and I'd never been in a place like this, and I thought it was great. They moved to Miami. I look back on that time, and in comparison, Miami has been ruined. The development is just more, I think, than the environment can really handle. I was glad to be in Gainesville because it was more like the rural area that I grew up in Pennsylvania, without the mountains.
Okay. Now, sir, when you went to medical school, did you have aspirations about a certain kind of medicine you wanted to practice, or you were thinking about going to med school and getting through?
I went through a number of changes in what I wanted to do. I first just wanted to be a good old country GP, general practitioner. Then it was cardiology. Then it was ophthalmology. And but I graduated in, as I said, 63, and took a general medical internship.
In Gainesville or?
In Birmingham.
In Birmingham, okay.
Right.
So getting to Birmingham, if you wouldn't mind, and kind of me asking also, what year did you meet your wife?
Harriet was a freshman at the university, and I was a first-year medical student, so that was 1959, right about this time.
Love at first sight.
Kind of.
All right. And then what year were you married?
61.
61, okay.
So I'm going to back up a second.
Okay.
You asked about contrast from the North. My high school was fully integrated. Of course, there were neighborhood divisions, but the high school was fully integrated. And I wasn't aware of any racial tension. I mean, I was in the marching band with African American students and the football team. We played, went to all the football games in the marching band. Miami, I didn't really notice that much of a difference, but I wasn't there long. I never lived there. When I came to Gainesville, it was a shock. It's an emotional shock. Of course, my main environment was at the medical center, at the medical school and Shands Teaching Hospital. And I was just overwhelmed by seeing coloreds only on the restrooms, coloreds only on the water fountains. I was a rebel. I didn't obey the signs. Never got into any trouble with it, but it was a shock.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to talk to anyone about how shocking it was for you personally? Was it something you had to kind of internalize?
I think just Harriet.
Uh-huh.
But otherwise, no, I kept it to myself.
Mm-hmm. And so the signs it sounds like the signs were pretty ubiquitous in Shands and
until about 1961.
Okay. And then, so just a couple more questions about med school. Were there professors that you remember that kind of stuck out for you, who were like outstanding role models or teachers?
Yeah, certainly. They're pretty much gone now, though.
Right.
The first one that I ever met was the person who interviewed me in Boston. He came up to Boston for a meeting, and I was in college, and I had applied to medical school. He came up to interview, and we walked through the Fenway in Boston, and there was Emanuel Suter, who was a professor of microbiology. He subsequently was a dean of the medical school. That was my first encounter, and when I first came to look at the medical school, to look it over for myself, Mel Freed, who was a professor of biochemistry, spent a few hours with me and made a very good impression on me. I don't know what my impression was on him.
So it sounds like the University of Florida was really trying to recruit you to come to the university.
Well, I was one of the 40 lucky ones to get into the class. Yeah. Now it's quite different. It's over 100 medical students. We had 4 women in our class of 40, 2 of whom graduated. The first African-American woman was in the class, but unfortunately she didn't make it to graduation. Another professor that I had who was a standout and who really helped me was Jape Taylor, who was a cardiologist. He was kind of a scary individual.
How so?
Because when we made rounds, it wasn't really intimidation, but he expected a lot from you, and he expected you to do it right. Uh-huh. But when I applied for internships, I applied to only one. I wanted to go to Seattle, Washington. I wanted to get as far away as I could. And then Harriet was kind enough to be willing to come with me. But I never went out there for an interview.
Wow.
And they didn't accept me. And by the time they didn't accept me, the matching program for internships was over. Dr. Taylor went right to work finding me a spot. And the spot that he had found was in Birmingham. And my experience there was really excellent. So he's no longer with us, but I was really grateful to him.
What did you know about Birmingham before you and your wife moved out there?
Nothing good, everything scary.
So
It was,
for you, it had already had a reputation.
it was the summer of 1963, and the news coming out of Birmingham was awful.
Were there any kind of trepidations about going
Oh
there?
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can't say frightened, but we didn't know what we were getting into, and it was. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So what was the process, Dr. Pawliger, if you could just kind of walk me through how you moved from, now I assume that you're moving from Gainesville to Birmingham.
Yes.
So, like, how did you find a place to live? I mean, how did you do that transition?
Well, Harriet had graduated at the same time, and she also had to do an internship, and she was going to work at a hospital in Mobile, Alabama. And I was a few hours away from Birmingham. I was going to live temporarily in the hospital. They had quarters for the house staff until we could get together in about 6 months.
So you talked earlier about the contrasts between Gainesville and Miami. What were the first contrasts you noticed between Gainesville and Birmingham?
That's a hard question because I was so busy and so tired all the time as an intern that I guess I wasn't paying much attention to the contrasts. The hospital was located just a few blocks from a very large African-American neighborhood. And as I said, I was living in the hospital. But anytime I got off, maybe a couple of days a week, I was always a walker. I walked 3 miles from my home in Reading through hills to high school every day or back. So in Birmingham, I was walking too. And it was almost always through the African-American neighborhood. I guess because I had never been exposed to any racial tension, there was no concern at all. And there were never any incidents of any kind. I mean, I would say hello to people, they would say hello back to me. And that was it.
And what was the name of the hospital that you were working at?
It was the University Hospital and Hillman Clinic.
Okay, excellent. And so you were walking around, like, say, I'm trying to just kind of visualize the, like the Kelly, what became the Kelly Ingram Park area.
Yeah, I forgot there was a park nearby that I would have to walk through to get to that neighborhood.
Right.
Or walk around to get that neighborhood. But the University Hospital was the major hospital for Birmingham.
And so, but you were living, actually, in a way, you're kind of living in the hospital.
I was living in the hospital until Harriet came, and then we were lucky enough to get an apartment in a 6-story high-rise that was a couple of blocks from the hospital that was built for the house staff, interns and residents. We lived in a small apartment for about a month before that till we could get into that residence.
And did you see any, you mentioned before going to Birmingham, Birmingham already was in the news, the civil rights movement. There was had been a lot of mass demonstrations, kind of the eyes of the nation were already beginning to kind of focus there. Did you see any, remember seeing or hearing about protests once you arrived in Birmingham?
Yeah, that was the summer of the fire hoses and the dogs. And like I said, I was so busy and so tired most of the time that I wasn't really paying attention to what was actually going on at the time, except for what I guess heard in the news. And the police chief of Birmingham was just outrageous. And
Bull Connor.
Bull Connor, exactly. You got it. And just hit a nerve with me that I could not tolerate. So this was a little later on. This was Our daughter was born in January, so she was an infant. And it was sometime after that, and I really don't remember exactly what it was that got me to the boiling point. I told Harriet, I'm going to call him.
Wow.
Somehow I found his telephone number, home number. I don't know how I did that, but I called him. And Harriet protested, don't do it, don't do it.
You called Bull Connor?
I did.
Wow. What did he say?
As I said, I do not recall what the issue was, but I gave him a piece of my mind about that issue. And his response was, who is this? Who are you? Who's calling? I hung up before I could get traced.
That must have been an amazing phone call.
Well, fortunately, nothing happened.
Wow. But Dr. Pawliger, I mean, even though you had to be focused on your job, you're a medical resident. You know, they're working 24/7. You still have this sense of indignity about what's happening in Birmingham.
Yes, the only thing that really stands out was that one incident that I just couldn't tolerate until September, which was started in end of June, July. So I'd been there for 2 or 3 months. And every month we rotated to a different service. And in the month of September, I had my first emergency room rotation.
A faithful month
Yes.
in American history.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm getting emotional about it, but
Well, thank you, sir. And if there's any point where you want to kind of stop and take a pause or breather, then please let us know. But and if you wouldn't mind taking us into September, so this is your first time on the rotation where you're actually in the emergency room,
right.
and so if you could kind of describe what it was like to begin that service, like what was different from your past responsibilities.
As a medical student at the University of Florida, we didn't have any real emergency room experience. It was pretty much outpatient clinics and inpatient service, but never an emergency room service. So it was a new experience for me, and I really had to go through at least a few days of orientation with help from other interns that had already had emergency room. As I said, the university hospital was the main hospital. It was for the area. It was kind of like what I would imagine Bellevue Hospital is in New York. Trauma, illnesses of all kinds. And so it was a busy service.
How much sleep did you get?
We were on call 24 hours, and then we had 12 hours off, 24 on, 12 hours off, and maybe 1 day off a week.
So not much sleep.
No.
Right. And you hadn't had the opportunity at that point, after its medical school, the medical school training didn't really have an ER component to it.
No, not for me anyway.
Okay. So this is brand new for you.
Yeah. And you know, at that time, Alachua General Hospital was the emergency room for the Gainesville community. So the emergency room that Shands had was really not very busy.
So you had moved to emergency room responsibilities as a young doctor, and so you were on duty. And how long were you on duty before the events of September 15th?
I probably started about 7 a.m.
Wow. And when did you first hear that something terrible had happened?
What I heard was that there had been an incident, and we're going to get a lot of patients, injuries. And then it gradually came out as to what had happened. And by the time they started arriving, it went from a busy emergency room to turmoil.
Wow. What was turmoil? What, just the volume of people?
The volume of people that came in. To my best recollection, I have just a picture in my mind of the 4 girls who were killed, 4 little girls who were killed. They were placed in one particular room, and they kind of not physically sealed it off, but just tried to keep people out, keep people from gawking. And we had a lot of people with all kinds of wounds, shrapnel wounds, what I recall mostly. But the thing that got to me most of all was that a lot of people from the hospital came down to the emergency room. And this was the first time that I had any inkling that there was that much prejudice inherent in people that I never suspected it of before. If you can picture a very long hall with examination rooms, treatment rooms on either side, and along the hall was just a number of people who weren't doing anything except came down out of curiosity. And I was just walking back and forth, and I was hearing comments. The one that really stands out is, and they were referring to all the people who had been injured, because there was a lot of screaming, a lot of sobbing, a lot of crying. And the comment that sticks with me is that somebody said, "Look at them, they're just like animals."
That must have been infuriating to hear.
This was more sad.
What was as a doctor on duty, of course, your first responsibility is to your patients. What were you doing during those hours? Who were you seeing? What kinds of wounds were you trying to treat?
Well, as I said, it was my first experience. So part of it was triage to determine who we could take care of and who needed more treatment, who needed to be admitted for more intensive care, surgery. But what I was treating mainly were cuts, bruises, scrapes, superficial shrapnel.
Did you get a chance to talk to the patients as you were treating them? Were there stories coming out, or?
No, of course I did, but I don't recall. I don't have any recall about that. Mm-hmm. I think I was just so intent of not messing up.
Sure, you're right, exactly. How many, in your recollection, sir, how many hours were you on duty treating people who were victims of the bombing?
Oh, it was several hours, but I was in the ER or sleeping, but on call for the ER until 7 the next morning.
Wow. How many other doctors were there on duty?
I don't recall exactly, but probably about half a dozen.
Okay.
Rotating in that rotation. Mm-hmm. But a lot of other doctors came down to help out. And nurses.
So there's a sense that people did try to kind of work together to help in this terrible situation.
Oh yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. It was. I don't know if the hospital had a disaster plan at the time, but it was a disaster and people responded to it.
So, sir, when I'm just kind of thinking, kind of jumping ahead in the chronology. When did you first begin to have a chance to kind of think or process about this traumatic event? Because obviously at first you hear about the event, or you're treating people, you know a lot of people are coming in. But when was it when you first began to be able to kind of think about what had happened?
Probably the very next day, or at the most a few days afterwards. Because as I said, I routinely walked through the neighborhood that was near the hospital. I stopped doing that because I was afraid of the possible repercussions. So I don't think I ever walked in that neighborhood again.
Mm-hmm. Did you, in your recollections, do you feel like things changed after the bombing in terms of the way that people related to each other, or?
I don't recall anything like that.
Okay.
No, I think, as I said, it was the emergency room for the city. It was the closest hospital to the colored neighborhood, mm-hmm. and I don't think anything changed.
Wow. Did you have the opportunity to see the 16th Street Church, Baptist Church, after the bombing on television, or? On television,
but not in person. As I said, did not take the chance of going to the neighborhood.
Okay. Did the other doctors, did you all kind of talk with each other about it, or?
If we did, I don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But 2 months later, there was another shaking incident. And you probably recall what that might have been.
Oh, and the other question I wanted to ask too, sir, was did you talk to your wife about what was happening? Because was your wife still in Mobile, or no?
No, she had already come to Birmingham.
Okay. So did the two of you talk about what was happening in the city? Or?
Are you talking about, can I speak?
Oh yes, yeah, please, yeah. Just, oh yeah, come on.
Sir. I was in Mobile when the church was bombed. I was just about to come to live in Birmingham with him. And he was distraught over the telephone about what had happened, and just couldn't grasp that there could be such hatred. The second experience that you want me to tell the second experience?
No.
You're going to tell it? Okay.
Yeah.
That he alluded to it, that there
Oh,
was
yes.
another happening, which for both of us, we spent a lot of time talking about, and it was extremely powerful, and because I was there and I participated in it.
Mm-hmm.
But he'll explain it, and I've never gotten over it, neither has he.
Wow. One more question before that, though. So you were in Mobile when you first heard about the bombing?
Yes.
And what was your initial response?
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And then when I heard that he was participating in the medical care and that he received the Fort with girls, I was so sad, and I was scared for him.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of us grew up in an environment with such hatred. And so it was very hard to grasp that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. And David, you were about to talk about another incident too.
2 months later, in November 1963, I was on a medical ward rotation in the VA hospital, examining a patient. And the ward that he was in was right outside the nursing station, where the nurses and other doctors and personnel were gathered. I'm examining the patient, talking to the patient, and all of a sudden I hear these cheers and applause and clapping. What's going on? I mean, it was really loud, because it was right next to where I was. So I excused myself from the patient and told him I need to see what's happening out there. And I go out to the nursing station and what's going on? You didn't hear? What? Kennedy's been shot.
People are cheering.
Cheering and clapping and applauding.
It must have made you feel terrible.
Yeah, that is, what kind of people are these?
What kind of impact did that have, David, on you when you first heard that the president had been shot?
Oh, it's just hard to believe, and hoping that it wasn't fatal. Of course, we didn't know at that time that it was. Because it was almost instantaneously broadcast. And then just a lack of respect for people that I had no reason to disrespect before.
Were some of those people who cheered people that you already kind of knew or had gotten to know, or you were still kind of an outsider?
I was pretty much still an outsider, but there were people that I was working with, and had to continue working with. So I don't think my relationship really changed, but just some loss of respect.
Yeah. What was this? I know it's a pretty big question, but you're giving us so many amazing, important things to think about. As you kind of look back on that time, sir, what was the status of the country back then? I mean, there were so many things happening. Like, how would you characterize the United States in 1963 based on your experiences?
63 to 64? Mm-hmm. Do you have any hints?
That in many ways it hasn't changed.
I'd have to think about that.
Okay.
Nothing comes to mind readily.
I mean, when I'm listening to you, I'm just, I get a sense of just incredible turmoil, anguish, and then, I mean, you're one person trying to grapple with this, and you're in the middle of of an internship, and how do you balance all of these things?
So, at some point in time, I had to decide what I was going to do next. And of course, physicians were being drafted. We're coming up on the Vietnam era. And I wanted to avoid the draft. So I applied to the Public Health Service. And the choice was either to do a fellowship somewhere, a residency somewhere in medicine, or service of some kind to America. And I decided that I could very well get drafted after my internship. And I didn't want to be in the military, so I applied to the Public Health Service. Mm-hmm. When I was in high school, I was wrestling, and I got thrown and dislocated my shoulder.
Oh, shoot.
So I had several recurrences of the dislocation between high school and 1964. I applied to the Public Health Service. I wanted to work in the Indian Health Service. And they reviewed my application. I don't know how long it took, but I was rejected.
What was the Indian Health Service?
Indian outpatient clinics, Native American outpatient.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
But in the United States, okay.
Yeah, at that time it was called the Indian Health Service.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't referred to as Native American at that time. So,
But that's where you really wanted to work.
yeah, I thought that would be a good experience, and I could be making a difference somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I got a letter of rejection, and it didn't really state why, so I followed up on it, and I was told that it was because of your recurrent shoulder dislocation. You would probably have to be going out into remote areas, and if you dislocated your shoulder, you'd be disabled and there wouldn't be anybody to help you. So I was rejected.
What came next?
Well, I applied for a fellowship, at the university here, in University of Florida, and I was accepted to that. And I started that in July, and about 4 months later, I got a letter from Uncle Sam. You are hereby ordered to report for service in the United States Army.
My gosh.
And so they took me out of the fellowship, and in February 1965, I went to the Army Hospital in Fort Polk, Louisiana. Harriet followed me there. Our daughter was 13 months, and Harriet was pregnant with our second child.
So how long, sir, were you in Louisiana before your next station?
We were there I was there from February. Harriet, I think, came in March. We had a really nice living situation in a little subdivision a couple of miles from the Army base. I worked in the Army Hospital outpatient clinic. And I think probably in September of '65, I got orders transferring me to a unit, engineering unit, combat engineers, which were slated to go to Vietnam. So I moved out of the hospital and I moved into the little medical clinic that they had for the combat engineer unit. And I was going to be the only doctor. I had some medics and a nurse or two. But I protested that assignment because if they were going to send me to Vietnam, why couldn't the Public Health Service take me?
Yeah, it seems like a little disjuncture there.
Yeah, there was. So I appealed, and I appealed on the basis of the shoulder. I'd also had a back injury and ruptured disc that interfered with the last month of my internship in Birmingham. So the Army reevaluated me, and they decided, no, this would not be an appropriate unit for you. We're going to put you in with a clearing company, which was also slated to go to Vietnam.
Now, Dr. Pawliger, were you talking about Vietnam at this point to people? Was there much of like a discussion, like why Vietnam, or what are we doing, or it was kind of, or those discussions weren't happening yet, or?
Oh yeah, they were happening. Nobody wanted to go. Nobody that I knew wanted to go. I sure didn't want to go. I think that regular Army people did want to go because that was good for their resume, basically, to be in a combat situation. But no, I certainly did not want to go. And leaving a wife, and by that time we had 2 infants, children. And so there was an incident that led to my going to Vietnam. And that was one of the doctors that I worked with got his orders to go to Vietnam. They lived across the street from us in this little subdivision. They didn't have any children. He was married, they had no children. They had 3 dogs. He also had a contact in Washington, I won't say who, but when he got his orders, they fell to pieces. A short time after he got his orders to go, a moving truck came, loaded them up, and away they went. And a week later, they were back unloading the van and moving back into their house. The speculation was that the very highly positioned person who he knew, or his family knew, got his orders changed. Well, within a week of his returning, I got my orders to go, and it was in his place. And this just infuriated Harriet. She was really angry with our government.
Yeah.
We had a 12-week-old and a 20-month-old.
Wow. But they had 3 dogs.
They had no children,
Wow, just incredible.
and it didn't seem fair.
No, it wasn't fair.
But so I spent my time in Vietnam. Actually, it was supposed to be a 12-month service, and then come back and spend another 4 months somewhere, wherever the Army assigned me. But while I was there, I went from the lowest, I came in as a captain, and I came out as a captain, but I was also the newest person in that unit. And by the time I left, everybody else had rotated home. And I was the most senior person, and against my protest, I became the commander of the unit, commander of the clearing company, which was okay. I mean, in retrospect, it was okay. Our sergeant was the real officer, non-commissioned officer of that, and I just did what he told me to do. But no, the Army developed a policy that is, if you extended your service in Vietnam for a month, spent 13 months, you could be discharged early. And so I elected to do that. I don't want to spend any more time in the Army than I needed to. It would have been disruptive to Harriet and the children. And so in November 1966, I came home.
Wow. So, sir, but in Vietnam, the clearinghouse unit, where were you?
Clearing company.
Clearing company. Where were you actually stationed in country?
They rushed us over there, said that we were needed, but it took 16 days to get there by military transport ship, the USS Buckner, USS Simon B. Buckner. We were dreading it all the time that we were at sea going over there, because we didn't know what to expect. And when we landed, we were loaded into a C-130, I think.
Cargo plane.
Cargo plane, yeah. We and our equipment, and we were landed at Benoit. No, we landed at Benoit Air Base, which was already established, and we were taken to an empty field next to Benoit. It was called Long Binh. There was nothing there. Hot, humid, sweaty. We set up our tents, 200-man company, and we didn't know what we were going to do. They said we were necessary, we were being rushed over there, 16 days rush, but they didn't know what to do with us. So after about a week of doing nothing, except listening to the long guns, they set up an artillery unit right next to us, and at night they were firing missions which were earth-shaking. We had 3 platoons, 2 doctors in each of the platoons, and they took my platoon, which is 3rd platoon, and they decided to send us out into the wilderness, which was really scary. So we were sent to a place called Phu Loi, which was a little village north of Saigon, but adjacent to the village was an old Japanese airstrip. And the 1st Division Artillery set up its headquarters there, set up an artillery unit, and then gradually, over a period of time, it grew to about a 4,000-man base with all types of Army units. And our little clearing company was basically the medical support for them. At the beginning that we were there, maybe the first few weeks, the combat units that were out fighting in the boondocks brought their casualties to us, usually by helicopter. And that's where I learned the word dust off, because they came in and hovered as they landed, and this was just a dusty field, no vegetation, and just dust all over the place. A lot of these people that they brought in were too wounded for us to really manage. We had to put them back on the chopper, and they'd go back to Saigon or closer to Saigon to a larger unit. Mm-hmm. Those that we were able to take care of, we did.
What were some of the types of wounds that you were seeing that may have been, well, let me rephrase that. So you're in a new situation. There's a war going on. What was different about being a doctor in Vietnam than being a doctor in the United States?
Several things. Much of what we did was boredom. Didn't have anything to do. But as the base got larger, more personnel, we were the sick call unit. And they also decided to use us for patients who were recuperating from malaria. There was a lot of malaria, a lot of dengue fever, and we set up a little hospital in tents, and we took care of those people. In terms of wounds, they were, again, maybe lacerations, superficial shrapnel wounds, and just general Army sick call. Gradually, the politics of the war, I forgot exactly what it was called, but there was a term for it. But we were given responsibility for also making sick call for the Vietnamese. So there were a lot of Vietnamese who were working on the base, and they came to us for their illnesses. And eventually, maybe once or twice a week, we would go out into the Phu Loy village and hold sick call there. Mm. There was also a house of ill repute in the village, and a high incidence of venereal disease. We were ordered to give prophylactic penicillin injections to the women, which I refused to do because it wasn't good medical care. Mm-hmm. What we were going to induce was resistant gonorrhea.
Oh. And who would give such an order, though, knowing that was not a...
Well, that was it. The order came from a non-medical person, the artillery commander of the base. I guess his order came from somebody, but I don't know who. Mm-hmm. And I protested, and he said, well, you can protest, but then we're going to put you in the brig.
Yeah, because I was going to say that could be a court-martial offense, right?
They were going to arrest me if I refused to do it. So again, I didn't want to do that. So I went ahead and practiced medicine that was beyond the pale. Mm-hmm.
But you still protested and tried to let people know, hey, this is not a good...
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Were there other situations where, as a doctor, you felt that in combat or in a war, that the ethics of medical... So again, let me rephrase the question. Does war change kind of the ethical role of the doctor? Or is it just a new kind of situation that you're in?
There was one incident of ethics at Fort Polk. Harriet calls me a white knight. Taking sick call, just seeing patients on a regular basis in our clinic at the Army Hospital. And I'm seeing patients. We had a sign-in sheet for people, and they were seen in the order in which they appeared, except if they were really ill, then we would give them priority. Mm-hmm. I'm examining a patient one day, and the nurse knocks on the door, walks in. She says, Dr. Pawliger, I've got a patient that's not on your schedule you should see next. I said, oh, what's the problem? She said, she has a headache, something like that, something minor. I said, well, why do I see her next? She's not on the schedule. She says, well, she's the Fort Polk general's daughter, the commanding officer of the base. I said, well, that's good. If she's not really ill, she can take her turn. Just put her on the schedule. No, you don't understand. It's the general's daughter. Well, just put her on the schedule. I'll see her in her turn. And that's what happened. The next day, I got called into the hospital commander's office. And I can imagine what happened. So maybe that also contributed to my going to Vietnam.
Wow. Dr. Pawliger, when you were in Vietnam, were people in the unit talking about the and I guess I'm kind of projecting ahead because we all know that there will be a lot of resistance to the war from both within the military, but also in colleges and campuses and things like that. But you were there was it 65 or 66 or
February 65 to November. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's wrong. October 65 to November 66.
Yes, sir. So I guess what I'm kind of thinking about, and this might be just grasping at straws, but you probably have seen the television show MASH. And in MASH...
Harriet took me to see it it was in the movies.
Right. And on the television show, which of course is a television show, very well acted, but obviously, make-believe, it's set in the Korean War, and the doctors, there's always a little bit of political discussion in a lot of the show, where the doctors are, what are we doing here, and everything, and some people are trying to get out and stuff, and there's the turmoil of war. Was there any bit of that when you were there? Did people begin to talk about the war and say, what are we doing here? Or was it just was it too intense to really have those discussions?
Well, I think for the most part, we felt like we were doing a service. Mm-hmm. We were physicians, and the people that we worked with, our corpsmen and the other people in the company, they felt like, we could be doing this in the United States too, might as well be doing it here. Mm-hmm. Except when things got a little hairy with various attacks. But no, the only political thing that I really remember is we were bombing North Vietnam, or we were bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And at some point in time, the president ordered the bombing to stop. It was President Johnson. Mm-hmm. And I really got upset about that because I wasn't thinking of the human toll that the bombing was taking. I was thinking about the human toll that the North Vietnamese army marching down from the north was taking, or potentially taking, on us. Mm-hmm. By stopping the bombing, they were putting us in more danger. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think that was appropriate, that they should be doing everything they could to support us.
Right. Now, sir, you were in Vietnam around 13 months.
Yes.
Okay, so, and of course...
Exactly 13 months.
Exactly.
Not a day later.
Not a day later, right. In retrospect, obviously you go on to have this really distinguished career. How did that experience of Vietnam contribute to your career?
Again, not so much to my career, but the lesson that I really learned that I wasn't really aware of, emotionally or intellectually aware of before, was that people anywhere are pretty much the same. The people that I met, that I worked with, who were Vietnamese, they had the same concerns, the same goals, the same kind of interests that we did. Be able to take care of their family, house them, feed them, security, clothe them. And they weren't really political. They were as frightened as we were of what the prospects were from the war. Mm-hmm. And I think 99% of people in the world are just like me and Harriet and you.
Mm-hmm. Did your attitude towards the war change as you returned back home to your family? I mean, obviously the war is really beginning to escalate in 67, 68, the Tet Offensive. What thoughts did you have on that, as best as you can remember, kind of back then, on the war in general?
We needed to get out of there because I didn't think we were going to make any difference.
Mm-hmm. And was that an assessment that you came to that understanding when you were still in Vietnam, or after you?
After I came back.
Okay.
It was still pretty early while I was there.
Right.
It was just building up, but by 1968, when the real turmoil occurred, the riots, I just didn't see any sense in it.
Mm-hmm. Where were you by that point, sir, in terms of your medical profession, family? Were you back? So you're back in the United States,
right?
And I don't recall, are you down here yet, or are you still?
No, I came back. I finished my fellowship, and then I started residency training in 1967, middle of '67. Did 2 years of internal medicine residency, found out that I really wanted to be a hematologist because I enjoyed a rotation in hematology. Mm-hmm. So I did a year's fellowship in hematology, and then I was offered an assistant professorship in the Department of Medicine, and also a position to begin an internal medicine service at the Student Health Service, the infirmary.
Oh, wow. Had that existed before?
It was a general medical clinic at the Student Health Service, okay. But they didn't have an internal medicine specialist. There was an internist who was in charge, mm-hmm. but he was purely administrative. He wasn't seeing patients. So I started an internal medicine service there.
Oh, wow, at the infirmary?
Yeah.
Was that located where it is now? Or has that... Terrible question, because the campus has changed so much, but
yeah,
because the infirmary now is on what street is that? 19th, and
it was really just east, I think, of the gym.
Okay, so yeah, it's still around the same.
Yeah,
same
it was an old building.
Mm-hmm. They're thinking about repurposing the building.
Yeah, I saw that.
From what I understand, yeah. I mean, yeah, we love the infirmary. It's one of the last places we can park.
I became the director of the general medical clinic at the university at Shands, and I stayed for 2 years, and I really enjoyed patient care and teaching, and I started to do some research. But then the Department of Medicine chair, began to prevail on me to do some more administrative things, which I really did not want to do. And at that time, there was a new medical group that was forming, and they invited me to join them, and so I left the university in June '72.
Okay, and what was that medical group called? What was that?
The Tower Medical Group.
Okay, and was that in Florida, or?
Oh yeah, it was. We built an office on Tower Road.
Oh, okay.
And it was.
I should know that.
It was just before. Just as North Florida Regional Medical Center was being built, mm-hmm. before the hospital opened.
Okay. Wow. So that, in the 70s, my understanding, my wife and I didn't move here in 2008. My understanding is the 70s were a time of a lot of things changing in Gainesville and UF. Do you remember something of those times?
Of course, Gainesville was growing.
Yeah.
I mean, when we first came here, as I said, 34th Street was the edge of town. We liked to take drives when we had time, and so we would usually drive west and past 34th Street. We're in the country.
Right.
Now we live in what was the country.
Yeah.
I think there were two theaters downtown, and that they gradually closed. The mall on Main Street opened, I think, in the 70s. Gainesville Mall.
Gainesville Mall.
Where the Oaks Mall was just a large field with horses and a big grove of oak trees, hence the Oaks Mall. We hated to see that get destroyed, but growth.
Well, it might be going back to the cows.
I heard.
the way things are going. Well, Dr. Pawliger, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and I know you have an appointment to start thinking about, but if you could, I wonder maybe a couple of questions, if you don't mind, about the types of changes you've seen, in Gainesville, or maybe even the country, between the time that, you're a young doctor, and then as your career develops. I mean, what has changed here, and what hasn't changed?
Well, I think physically, there's been a lot of change. I mean, I'm really concerned personally because this has been known as Tree City. And I'm really distressed by the amount of clear cutting that's going on. I mean, this is really, I think, wrong. And I've got my own personal opinion about why that's happening, but I think we're going to regret that. Development is okay to an extent, but it's getting beyond the point where Florida is becoming unrecognizable as Florida. This is starting to happen in Gainesville. We made a visit to friends who live in Palm Harbor in the Clearwater area. We drove down there on I-75 through Tampa and then over. And we decided to come back on Route 19 from Palm Harbor, which runs along the west coast. From, I guess, all the way from Clearwater up to Crystal River. You don't know you're in Florida. It's just strip malls and traffic lights and used car lots until you just get north of Crystal River, and then you're in Florida again. And I just hate to see that happening.
Yeah, so many trees are getting cut down here, you're right. I mean, it really is distressing.
And then I'm concerned about what's happening to the aquifer, our springs, our water supply. And I think we're just developing beyond our capacity to make Florida a desirable location, except for its climate, which is going through change also. So.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to give Mrs. DuPree a chance to ask questions, but one last question just came to mind was, what kind of advice would you give a young person now who's thinking about embarking on a career in medicine?
It bothers me that I've had some colleagues who have discouraged their children from going into medicine because of their own personal experience with government issues, regulations, insurance issues, etc. I would not do that to my children. Right? We're going to have a physician shortage. We're going to have a shortage of good physicians. And I would encourage people to go into medicine because it's a really fulfilling profession, and I can't think of anything that I'd rather do.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
There's one thing that I left out. That
Okay.
I don't know. It's really Harriet. Harriet was also doing a internship at the VA hospital at the same time I was, that I gave that incident about President Kennedy. And she had exactly the same experience in the area that she was working.
I was doing an internship in occupational therapy at that time, and was working with a man in his room. And we heard all of the clapping and screaming, and it sounded like a football game, cheering.
But this was in a different area of the hospital.
But it was in Birmingham.
Yeah.
At the same hospital.
At the same hospital,
VA
yeah.
hospital. And my patient said, what's going on? I said, it sounds like a party. Let me go look and I'll come back and tell you. And I saw many, many African American patients in wheelchairs sitting in the hall, sobbing. And the staff behind the desk laughing and clapping. And I said, what's happening here? It just didn't make sense. They said, oh, President Kennedy's been shot. And I was in disbelief. I was in disbelief that there were human beings, no matter what your political persuasion is, that could cheer and laugh and be happy that somebody was being assassinated. And I can remember that day. I can remember exactly where I was. And it's still inconceivable to me. So, but I did want to say that David, you were talking about the university hospital. When I finished my internship, I took my first job at the university hospital. The atmosphere was very different because it was filled with people who came there from many different places. It wasn't just all local people. And it was like night and day in terms of the people that I worked, the acceptance, the lack of bigotry, etc. It was two different hospitals and two totally different environments.
Wow. A big difference.
Big difference.
And so you think it was really, in some ways, that by that point, there's an international, or movement of international people kind of into the university. And it's also, of course, you have the civil rights movement, and that's been going for about 20 years. So, but these things are making a difference.
I think that, as David pointed out before, that people are more alike than different. And that prejudice is lack of understanding and knowledge about what you don't understand or who you don't know. And as you meet more and more people from different areas and you learn that they're basically very much like you are and you like they are, that bigotry and prejudice goes way down. And I've had other experiences in my life that prove that to me.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that insight. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you.